So Coraline is a thing.
Caroline what?
Coraline.
Be honest, this movie creeped you out as a child, didn't it? I mean, it creeped me out, and I watched it as an adult for the first time. People said it was spooky, and I know that I'm a chicken shit, so I kept waiting for the right time to watch it, which never came. However, it is once again Spooktober, and just as in the past, that means I have to figure out what I'm going to talk about that is horror related without really having to talk about horror. And in true This Is a Thing fashion, the easiest way around this is to look at horror as a concept and genre, or why and how it works. And so I picked a movie that has intrigued me for a long time. I am fascinated by the idea of horror movies. I just don't like being actively terrified. This is both the reason I have always wanted to see Coraline and the reason why I kept putting it off. But then my editor Alyssa was like, hey, you should do Coraline for Spooktober. And I was like, well, I can't say no because I haven't seen it, so I guess I have to watch Coraline now. Fuck. But despite my hesitation, and how legitimately creepy it was, I loved this movie. I have a real soft spot for Laika Studios. I've already done an episode on Paranorman, and I have mentioned Kubo and the Two Strings in another episode, and Coraline does not disappoint. I adored the dark side fairy tale narrative filled with wonder and mystery which slowly turned sinister. It was unsettling at first. There was a sense of unease as the fantastical events of the other world went from inexplicable to volatile. It's a masterclass in dread and creepiness without the need for jump scares. Honestly, it's probably a better horror movie in that sense than some of its recent live-action counterparts. But the fact that Coraline is such a well-crafted horror movie sort of begs the question, who is this movie for? Like, really? Who is this movie for? The gothic aesthetic, even the body and physical horror, both implied and shown, all scream horror movie. Despite the lack of blood, I think Coraline embodies both the grotesqueness of physical horror and the downright dread of a thriller. And yet, despite this, Coraline continues to sit in the category of children's animation. The characters, marketing, and a lot of the themes are very much indicative of children's media and animation, and what's more, this disparate combination of horror and children's animation is largely what keeps Coraline in the zeitgeist. And that is because this movie is actually a horror movie and a children's animated adventure movie. Or to be more precise, it's part of an emerging subgenre of literature and art known as children's horror. This movie and others both before and after it have begun to redefine the way children's media as a whole is accepted and understood through its history and inception, its position as a gateway to other genres and culture, and its connection to the horror film and adherence to the children's story structure. And although it's not the first or most recent movie to do this, it is a great example of all of these points, and it's also just really fucking creepy when you get down to it. And so today, I want to talk about Coraline. Coraline started out as a massive risk for Laika Studios, as the newly created company had not produced anything under its new name. Formed as a collaboration between several creatives, including James and the Giant Peach director Henry Selick, no, it was not Tim Burton who directed that movie, and a few other minds at the failing Will Vinton Studios, Laika Studios was created with the purpose of finding funding to create full-length movies. Around this time, Henry Selick met with internationally renowned author Neil Gaiman, only to find that Gaiman was a huge fan of Selick's work on The Nightmare Before Christmas, which was also Selick and not Tim Burton, and was eager to share a new project with Selick that he had just finished writing, the short story Coraline. After reading the original, Selick figured the story could be adapted into a roughly 40-minute long animated short, and began pre-production on what the look and structure of this short would be. It was then that he stumbled upon the works of Tadahiro Usugi, whose unique characters and colors really resonated with Selick and the other creatives. Usugi was brought in to create concept art for the look of the film, but over time the structure of the movie changed. The story was reworked and fleshed out, and characters such as Wybie were added. All of a sudden, Selick found himself with a full-length stop-motion project on his hands, and Usugi was kept on board to help design and create set pieces and art for the whole film. Selick was of course familiar with directing stop motion, and Laika Studios also had a significant hand in the creation of The Corpse Bride, which Tim Burton did actually direct, or co-direct. Laika Studios was already set up for stop-motion animation, and Coraline began production in Oregon, where 300 to 400 people worked on the film, from stop-motion animators, 3D printers, CAD animators, post-production animators, and countless more set designers and costume makers. Even with such a large crew, they were still only producing about 100 seconds of film per week. I've used this clip before, but what the heck, I'll do it again.
Oh my god. That's the whole thing.
That's 3 weeks of work.
This means that the voice actors probably went years without seeing the results of their work. Dakota Fanning, who was cast as Coraline, was probably around 12 when she recorded her voice, but closer to 16 when the movie was released. That's a significant change in age. The movie also featured the voices of Ian McShane and one of my personal all-time favorites, Keith David. The movie was released in early 2009 and immediately turned heads. Oh, that is not what I meant. Coraline has since become a staple of creepy movies and the topic of nightmare fuel for a whole generation of children. And adults too, if we're being honest. But even at the time of its release, critics were torn, with some suggesting the movie was too childlike for the adults it was aimed at, or too frightening for the children it was marketed towards. But everyone agreed that the movie was impressive. The narrative was deep and interesting, the animation was outstanding. Just look at that tunnel effect. I never get tired of that. And the music was both wondrous and sinister to fit the needs of the story. Plus that garden scene.
Daughter in distress.
What, do they get Jaco Pastorius to write this section? Okay, that joke was only for me, but I don't care, it's my show. Next section! I want to be able to reference the story or themes so you know what I'm talking about. So here's a brief summary and also your spoiler warning in case you haven't seen the nightmare fuel that is Coraline, or don't want to, because that shit is creepy. A young girl named Coraline moves with her parents from Michigan to Oregon under the pretense of doing more gardening, which is related to their job. However, once the family has moved to the Pink Palace apartments, it becomes clear to Coraline that her parents are not interested in gardening, or their displaced daughter, or really anything that isn't finishing their gardening manuscript. Coraline is disgruntled at being forced to move, upset that she will have to wear a uniform at her new school, but most of all, bored and lonely. And the only person her age around is the very bizarre Wyborn, or Wybe for short. One rainy day, Coraline is stuck inside and discovers a sealed door in the living room of her apartment, and is ecstatic at the thought of adventure. But once open, the door only reveals bricks behind it. But that night, some strange mice come out of the wall and wake Coraline. She follows them to the door and finds a tunnel leading to an alternate version of her world. Still a sick visual. In this other world, there is a kind mother, a musical father, and many wondrous sights and sounds. The only thing out of place is that everyone here has buttons for eyes. For the next few days, Coraline meets her neighbors and then proceeds to meet their otherworld counterparts, which seem to all be improved versions, including a Wybe that doesn't talk.
I like it.
These new parents dote on Coraline and ask her to stay, but in order to do so, she must sew buttons onto her eyes. She refuses, and the other mother shows her true colors and locks Coraline up. Here, Coraline finds 3 spirits of other children that have been taken by the evil lady, and they ask her to bring back their eyes so they can be free. With the help of the otherworld Wybe and a talking cat, Coraline escapes back to the real world only to find her parents have been taken by the evil other mother. Coraline returns to the otherworld with the talking cat and challenges the creepy lady to a game. Coraline will find her parents and the missing children's eyes before time runs out, or sew buttons onto her own eyes. So Coraline finds the children's eyes as the world around her begins to break apart, which is a stunning visual. She then plays a trick on the creepy old lady, who is actually a terrifying spider thing made out of sewing needles. Fucking gross. And she finds her parents and then returns to the real world. But as long as the key remains, the old lady can still escape. So Coraline runs to the abandoned well where she first met Wybe. But the needle monster's hand escapes from the door and tries to get the key. But with the real Wybe's help, they throw the key and the hand down the well and seal it. Coraline and her parents then begin planting tulips in the garden with all of their neighbors, and Coraline returns to her life of normality. And probably a few years of therapy.
I'm probably scarred for life. I think I'm gonna go stare at a wall for a while and rethink everything.
It doesn't appear that the story of Coraline is really all that creepy. I mean, when you get down to it, it follows the same basic structure as Alice in Wonderland. Going to another world, through a tunnel or hole, there's a talking cat that disappears. It's the same. It's Alice in Wonderland! It's just Alice in Wonderland! All joking aside, the similarity to Alice in Wonderland is not a coincidence or plagiarism. It's a purposeful allusion to the story of Alice in Wonderland as a classic piece of children's literature that many people are familiar with, and so the language of that kind of story is easily understood. Not to mention the fact that some parts of Alice in Wonderland are kind of creepy. Which goes to show that Coraline is not the first to do an upside-down kind of fairy tale story, nor is it even close to the first story to inject some creep factor into these kinds of narratives. And it's not even the first children's horror story. Despite being underappreciated, little discussed, and not very researched, children's horror has actually been around for quite some time. I already mentioned a few movies that came before Coraline, such as The Corpse Bride, The Nightmare Before Christmas, and James and the Giant Peach. Although we might not call them outright horror movies, they do play with a creepier aesthetic, which is greatly elevated by the medium of stop motion. Around the same time as Nightmare and James and the Giant Peach, there were a few other attempts that were closer in concept to what we would call horror for children in the world of live-action television. Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps were created in the early 90s and both filmed in suburban parts of Canada. I don't blame them. It's a scary place. On the animation side, there was the all-time classic,
Tales from the Crypt Keeper!
I couldn't help myself, as well as the Beetlejuice cartoon, and later on, Courage the Cowardly Dog. Interestingly, both the live-action and animated shows seemed to stick to and derive great success from an anthology format. But it was clear that there was a boom and great success in the emerging genre of children's horror, which began as far back as 1990. Meaning children's horror has been a niche but viable well of content for producers and filmmakers for 3 decades now. Although children's horror in movies has still not found great success, with only a few movies dipping their toes into the genre, possibly because anthologies are harder to do in movie form. But this is only in the visual medium. In literature and oral traditions, scary stories directed at children were used as morality plays and warnings for years. The stories from the Brothers Grimm are often punctuated with physical horror of cutting off toes or having one's eyes or tongue gouged out. The most obviously scary of these is Hansel and Gretel, which apart from already being kind of creepy and for children, has been retold as a horror movie more than a few times. Now, these kinds of stories were told more for morality than entertainment, and were intended to scare children from certain behaviors, or to warn them about the perceived horrors of the world. They were not intended as horror in the way we understand it today as a genre or mode of entertainment, but nevertheless, they were intended for children and are pretty creepy. The biggest reason that these older fairy tales were not considered horror has to do with the creation and understanding of horror as a whole. From there, we can look at how children's horror differs. It's difficult to speak to any precise point in time for when horror truly began, as a lot of literature contains the criteria to be classified that way, but it's largely agreed upon that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the first true instance of what would become known as the horror story. It's also considered the first science fiction, if anyone was wondering, and at the time all of these books were classified as gothic fantasy, so you can see how all 3 of these genres were once and to some extent still are closely tied together. But following this work came other stories such as Carmilla, Dracula, and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and eventually the entirety of horror as a genre. 100 years after Frankenstein, horror now had a fairly vast catalog of stories to choose from, and with the invention of the moving picture, shocking and gruesome sights were often experimented with in order to capture audiences' attention. As film became more ubiquitous and accessible to regular people, the pool of literature also grew. Horror was consistently in film circulation. But in 1934, the Motion Picture Production Code was introduced and left a lasting impact on horror that would eventually affect even children's horror. These rules, also known as the Hays Code, were a set of morality guidelines that dictated what kinds of things could or could not be shown to audiences. Under the strict weight of the Hays Code, horror on screen floundered. Movies were not able to depict scenes of a gruesome nature or show good characters doing anything morally reprehensible, and so the genre was reduced to mad scientists and creature features. And I got no problems with a good creature feature or a mad scientist flick, but there just wasn't a lot of room to experiment and try new things. In 1968, when the Hays Code was lifted, horror once again returned to its former glory and has since continued to be a bit of a cultural touchstone for the fears and unrest in society, acting as a kind of barometer for the culture the story is presented to and written by. Now horror is a large genre and industry with several subgenres and offshoots including thrillers, slashers, torture porn, ghost stories, international horror of all kinds from all different countries, and of course, children's horror. But what is it that binds all these kinds of movies together? Or to be more blunt, what the heck makes a horror story? According to horror scholar Isabel Cristina Pinedo, a narrative must satisfy 5 criteria in order to be horror. Number 1. The story must have a violent disruption to the normal world of everyday life. Note that this does not have to be physical violence, although it often is, but this can also be a disruption of the viewer just as much as it is the characters. Think about how The Ring takes something mundane, like a VHS tape, and has a ghost girl crawl out from the TV. No violence, but it's hella disruptive. Disruptive in my underwear. Number 2, the story must violate boundaries. These are often social mores or ideas that are held as culturally sacred. Things like cannibalism or sex are often explored in subversive ways. Number 3, the story must have the characters and or audience questioning rationality, like how Michael Myers or Leatherface are less like people and more like monsters in the shape of a man. There's no reasoning, there is only death. Number 4, The story does not need to have closure, and indeed may benefit from the subversion of traditional narrative structure. And we're not talking about endless sequels. We're talking about the lack of a need to leave the story resolved in any meaningful sense if it adds to the spookiness of the experience. Number 5, the story produces defined boundaries of its scary experience. The scary story only happens within the confines of a certain geography or if certain behavior or actions are taken. But that also extends to the movie itself. Once the movie is over, the scary experience is over. Otherwise, you would be left in a state of constant anxiety. And we call that torture. Or an average Tuesday if you're me.
Why were you born?
Ooh, that hurts. Children's horror actually follows all of these rules, with only 2 exceptions, and of course we're going to use Coraline as an example. Coraline is introduced as a regular young girl. The disruption to her life is not just her moving to a new place, but also when she sleeps and subsequently goes to the tunnel, which by the way is still a sick visual effect. At first, the new world seems glorious, but eventually Coraline is trapped there. That is a big upset, and when she does leave, she finds her parents have been taken, another big violation of her life. Plus, the threat of physical violence of both losing her eyes and later her mortality provide a violence that is in stark contrast to the mundanity of Coraline's dreary home life. Being a portal fantasy, or a story where the character finds a path to another world of magic, Coraline violates the boundaries of the mundane world, but also violates the usual story beats of these kinds of narratives. It's a bedtime dream that becomes a nightmare. Even the very nature of Coraline being a children's horror movie is a transgression of both the concept of what is for children and horror. It brings those 2 disparate things together under one movie. As a portal fantasy, Coraline brings us to a world where the rules of reason don't make sense, but as a horror movie, the beldam, or evil needle spider lady, doesn't seem to follow logic, both narratively and personally. In the story, she wants to love Coraline but has no idea what that means and will stop at nothing to possess her, despite Coraline's protests. She's also confined to her own world until the very end, where she breaks free and begins tormenting Coraline in the real world, violating boundaries, yes, but also defying the story's implied rules. Now we reach the last 2 rules of horror stories, and this is where children's horror changes slightly. In children's stories, the ending always has a resolution where the character returns home, and usually back to normal. Coraline does this perfectly, and it is probably the biggest distinction between traditional horror and children's horror. If Coraline didn't make it home, or if one or both of her parents had been left in the other world, then I don't think Coraline would have or could have been a children's story, as the ending would have drastically altered the overall tone of the movie. Imagine a movie where the ending is Coraline being taken by child services because her parents have disappeared and seemingly deserted her, or Coraline sewing buttons onto her own eyes and staying in the other world against her will, or even if she willingly stayed and became a twisted version of herself. Yeah, those are all very different and horrific endings that don't feel like they should be for children. But instead, Coraline has learned, sacrificed, and come home with her parents. That is a classic resolution for children, even if it isn't for horror. Which brings us to the last step, which I think is the most important for children especially. The horror experience is wrapped up within the confines of the movie's runtime, particularly in conjunction with the closure in the ending. The scary time is over, and the viewer, like Coraline, returns to the world of sanity. I think it's pretty clear that children's stories can fit into the realm of horror, but why is it that the idea of horror and things that are for children have never really been copacetic? Many people think that horror is inappropriate for children, and with good reason. Sex, violence, swearing, drug use, gore, and abuse are often the central focus of horror movies and are probably not appropriate for young kids. Not to mention there's a lot of adults who can't handle scary things, like me, so why would we want to subject children to them? Well, a large part of this thought process probably comes from the Hays Code and the Western Judeo-Christian ideals that went into making it and are probably still plaguing Western society. I'm not saying that sex, gore, and violence and all of those things are things we should show children. I'm just saying that maybe we have been too heavy-handed in how we apply our restrictions. The Hays Code tried to control what everyone, but to a large extent what children would see on screen in order to protect them from their own curiosity. And the things the Hays Code explicitly left out were things like violence and sex, or even the implications of those things. And I think that the values the Hays Code left on the way we view media still have an adverse effect on what we think is appropriate for children. The result of the Hays Code was not just bad horror movies, but also a lack of room for children to discover themes and themselves through more mature concepts in a safe way. Because paradoxically, children's horror doesn't frighten children at all. Okay, yeah, it probably does frighten them, but that's really the point. Children's horror allows kids to be scared and explore the idea of fear and terror in a safe and confined amount of time where they can explore the fun and exhilaration of the horror genre, and in a way that speaks to their sensibilities. It may also allow for an outlet to explore how to deal with more complex feelings that were discouraged in previous generations. Movies like Coraline, as defined by the aforementioned alterations to the rules of horror, are complex in their approach, both to the wonderful dream and dreadful nightmare of fantasy and horror, and in a way that is deep enough for all ages, but is focused on the problems of children. Coraline's biggest problem in the film, both thematically and narratively, is that the adults around her don't listen to her. She goes through life unheard. Her parents don't have time for her. Her new adult neighbors constantly misname her as Caroline.
До свидания, Caroline.
Even when she corrects them.
Coraline.
Caroline.
So in the beginning, the otherworld seems like a great escape. Here, her other parents listen and appreciate her, while her real parents don't believe her nighttime adventures are real. Even Wybie thinks Coraline is nuts.
You're crazy.
So Coraline retreats into a world where she feels heard, until her other mother begins to show her true colors, and then once again the adults around her stop listening to Coraline. When she refuses to sew buttons onto her eyes, her options are stay and sew the buttons on, or get locked up and stay until she sews the buttons on, and her protests go unheeded.
You're not listening to me!
I also think it's worth noting that the place where Coraline goes to feel safe is her parents' bed, even when they're not there. But she feels safe here, and this is brilliant because this is the place where I think every child feels safest, and it breaks my heart how sad and alone she looks in this scene. This fear of not being heard or appreciated is something that everyone suffers from, but especially children, who are largely marginalized by society because they are not the age of majority. So, a horror story where these fears are manifested in a mundane but realistic way, and then again in a very sinister way, is the perfect way to safely examine these fears, and then hopefully talk about them. Media literacy is very important. Some scholars also think that children's horror is an important gateway into mainstream culture and adulthood, through the examination of fear and more complex themes, but also through the visuals and narratives used in these movies. 2 years ago, I talked about the semiotics of horror in Paranorman, and how we understand the look and sound of horror, and how much fun that movie has paying homage to other horror movies, while exploring the concept of fear. Children's horror can be scary, but ultimately, it's a safe way to introduce children to the scenes, sights, and sounds of pop culture. Not just in specific scenes, like in Paranorman, but also the general language and shorthand that go into creating horror movies. Things like the music, camera angles, lighting, and tone. That way, young people are able to understand the references of the adult culture they live in, and are prepared to ingest more complex horror artworks because they've been exposed to the language used to tell these kinds of stories. It is astounding that children's horror stories have been largely relegated to books and television, with only a few, although very notable, movies diving into this scene. I think this is probably because the industry doesn't think parents would be likely to take their children to see a scary movie at the theater if given the choice. Horror has classically been a popular, but less prestigious genre and one of lower budget, although we're seeing a change in both of those things in recent years. But it turns out that children's horror movies tend to be excellent and critically acclaimed movies for all ages. In order to avoid higher age ratings from control boards, creatives are forced to craft their scares in a more deliberate way. Coraline carefully curates its dread without spilling a single drop of blood. It also expertly crafts its suspense, causing your stomach to clench in ever tighter knots. And the result is something that is perhaps not the most terrifying thing in the world, but it's indeed scary. But it comes from a place of care and craft for storytelling, both in the legacy of where it came from historically, but also in its alteration to the standard rules of horror stories, where it allows children to be scared with the understanding that the fear will end for both the characters and the audiences themselves. And no other children's movie has continued to creep children, and subsequently the adults they turn into, quite like this one. And that is why Coraline is a fantastically creepy children's horror movie. Here are my stray thoughts. I think that stop motion animation does a lot to add to the creepy movements and aesthetic of children's horror, and I wonder why there's never been an attempt to create a true adult horror movie with the medium. I also think it's worth noting that all the magical stuff that happens is right after Coraline is sleeping, which means it's possible that all the magical stuff is just her dreams and nightmares, and might explain why her parents don't remember anything. Although the needle hand coming out at the end and the fact that Wybie seems to see it do squash that argument. Either way, I was pretty freaked out watching this movie, and that's my fill of horror for the next year. Or 10. Happy Spooktober, everyone! Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. I really had a lot of fun watching Coraline, even though this was the first time that I saw it. I've watched it a few times now in order to make sure I got all the research right. Interestingly, a lot of the research that's been done on children's horrors come from some very, very interesting female academics. Go check that out. As always, the citations are in the description. While you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe so you'll never miss another episode of This Is a Thing and anything else going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.